Hey friends, today I thought we'd spend a little time with some show and tell of, hopefully I'm going to do a couple of videos today talking through some of my favorite parenting books. That's actually a pretty long list for me, but I thought I would show you a few um, and talk through them. So the first author that I wanted to share with you is Dan Siegel, and this is the first book that I was going to show you, which is Parenting. It's called Parenting from the Inside Out. It's by Dan Siegel and Mary Hartzell. Um, this has been out for a while. This book, Dan Siegel is brilliant, and I have several books that I want to talk about by Dan Siegel in this little video. This book in particular, Parenting from the Inside Out, is I think its thesis, its argument is that our best hope for best outcomes for our kiddos is really understanding what's happening for us. So the better that you understand your own reactivity, your own attachment style, your own triggers, your own life experiences that have led you to be where you are. The more that you have taken the time to digest that and understand that about yourself, just that, just an understanding leads to better outcomes for your kiddos. It's not even making the argument that you should work on it or do it differently. Just understanding it, maybe doing the work to unpack it with a therapist or, with some workbooks and things like that. Just going through the effort to understand what it is that makes you tick automatically leads to better outcomes for your kids. I'm sure, like you, like me, most of us would want our next generation to be doing better than the previous one. Like I hope that what I've learned in my experience of childhood, I pass on a better outcome for my kids. And my parents before me wanted the same. So there is a concept in psychology, in our culture, in all cultures, where we kind of repeat. There's something called multi-generational transmission process, and this basically summarizes that you do what was done for you. So if you were parented a certain way, you're going to parent in a similar fashion. If you have this particular attachment style, you're going to act out in ways that represent this similar attachment style in your parenting approaches and in your relating approaches. The templates that were informing your parents are informing you as their parents did before them. So this multi-generational transmission process, it's more than just like the way we relate to one another. It's other things like you'll see manipulative behavior is passed down from generation to generation. Unaliving yourself is something that you might see. Addiction behavior is something that you would see generation after generation. And usually we're wanting to do better. For example, if I have somebody whose parent raised them while they were in the throes of alcohol addiction, that person grows up and doesn't want their child to ever struggle with a parent who has an alcohol problem. So awareness of so again, going back to the Dan Siegel's argument, awareness of what has gone into making you who you are, just that awareness of it is already leads to better outcomes for your kids. I keep repeating the same thing, but I'm making the same point over and over because I think it's important. Of course, we want to do even better than that. I would hope that if you have trauma or you have a substance abuse problem or something like that, that you do more than just know it. I would hope that you take steps to improve, which then would lead to even better outcomes for your kids. I just think it's such an interesting thing to know that better outcomes from our kids. Like, we're all pretty motivated. If you're a parent, you're pretty motivated to do right by your kids, and knowing that the best thing you can do is just unpack your own stuff, understand your own stuff. I think that's a thrilling story. Also, in Parenting from the Inside Out, Dan Siegel gives real examples of himself in his parenting in very real ways. So it's an interesting thing to think about somebody who, like Dan Siegel, who has developed like concepts such as the hand model of the brain, which I'll get into in here in just a second. The upstairs brain, the downstairs brain, name it to tame it. Like all of our little parenting lexicon that people like me use all the time. Dan Siegel is the reason why we have that languaging. So when you think about, I believe is he a neuropsychiatrist? He's brilliant, but in what flavor? I think it's neuropsychiatry, or I apologize. I don't know. I'll put it in the show notes, what he actually is. But anyhow, to know that somebody who knows like the impact of what we say and do, like Dan Siegel knows very well the impact of what he says and does, and how that actually changes the structure of the brain, the physiology of the body, the attachment relationships, the self-regulation development, all of that stuff. Dan Siegel knows all of that from like a neurochemistry point of view. And even Dan Siegel loses his shit with his kids, and he'll tell those stories. So even with that, like somebody who knows, he's not a perfect parent. Like perfect parenting is a myth. It also doesn't lead to good outcomes for our kids. We have to be able to tolerate one another in real relationship. It's all about the way we relate to one another. So if I've got a perfect parent who's not like showing normal signs of how to be a human being and be in relationship with one another, where those rough edges are and what might set one another off and what thing irritates me because I was in a bad mood today, whatever, that doesn't set the child up for having real relationships with their friends, with their partners in the future, with their own children in the future. It doesn't set them up well. Having a real parent, and I just love that Dan Siegel was able to kind of like share some of the stories. It's not a book about him, but he did share a few stories in this book that really demonstrate like, yeah, he gets it, and yet he's also just like a normal human being. I find that very refreshing. I don't know if you do. Okay, so while I'm on the topic of Dan Siegel, so this whole video will just be about Dan Siegel books. I wanted to mention a few others, which I don't have in front of me, some other books that you might be interested in. And I'm looking down at my notes. So videos and books that you might be interested in terms of parenting knowledge and developing your own sort of personal approach to your parenting. So Parenting from the Inside Out, kind of getting to understand how what's going on for you impacts, how you do your parenting and what kind of outcomes we're going to get from your kiddos. He also has, and you can Google this, you can go on YouTube. We love YouTube. Go on YouTube and type in Dan Siegel, hand model of the brain. And, you'll hear many, many therapists who work with children explaining the hand model of the brain, because it's the easiest way. But Dan Siegel's the creator of it. So the idea of the hand model of the brain is, that we have this brain stem, and we're going to try to imagine this is our brain, like this, okay? And so it's kind of oriented this way. So this would be right here, right? Our prefrontal cortex is right here. And this being the brainstem, and this sort of the limbic system, the brainstem attachment stuff. And as you know, I have a bunch of content about the brain. But when you're trying to explain it to a child, you can't use language like the brainstem and the way that it develops, and the neurons and the connections and the cascade of fear and what's happening with all of the hormones that get kicked off in response to fear. You can't talk in that language, but you can demonstrate this motion with kiddos. So you can type into YouTube Dan Siegel hand model of the brain, and you'll hear him explain this so much better than I can. But essentially what he's saying is that we have this, kind of depiction of our brain, and When we're fine, when everything's going fine, then we're pretty regulated. We've got this part of our brain is like this. It's nice and settled, and that's our prefrontal cortex. When we get dysregulated, we he calls it flip your lid. You're flipping your lid, and what that means is that this access to this part of our brain goes offline. We can't get to it. Well, that's a problem because you know what's here is understanding, curiosity, humor, language. All of the ways that we might try to calm ourselves down go offline. And this is why we talk about, we're feeling creatures who think. We're not thinking creatures who feel, because when we're under threat, we lose the part of us that thinks about stuff and can like calm us down. We're not really top down regulated until with some improvements, we can become a little more top down regulated, but really biologically, we are bottoms up. Our sensory system is taking in the data and we're bringing it up. And as long as it's not a threat, so that's the first thing, is this a threat? We're checking. And as long as it's not a threat, then we can move up into our upper part of our brain, and we can have some thought about what we've just taken in from the data, from the senses. So where was I going with that? Oh, okay. So hand model of the brain, when let's say you're getting into an argument and you start to get distress, like you're not hearing me, or you're hurting my feelings, or something like that, that's perceived as a threat, right? And the brain you flip your lid when you're becoming dysregulated, is another way to refer to that. Look, I'm not modeling this very well because my thumb doesn't like stay down. Like if you make a B in sign language, this is supposed to stay here. I don't know. My thumb doesn't do that. So pretend it was like this. And then you kind of tuck this down over. Okay, so when the exciting thing about teaching this to children is you can give them the language of their experience, but also of your own. Oh, I'm starting to flip my lid, or I can feel myself flipping my lid, and and that's part of naming it. And naming it tames it, and it keeps it in place if we can name it. Or if you have flipped it, then other people aren't going to be expecting you to have access to all your vocabulary and all your problem solving skills. You just don't have access to that till the body calms down and the prefrontal cortex can come back online. And there are ways to improve how easily that flips, all kinds of stuff that you can do with it. But the first part is understanding that happens. It's important to understand that when we're in distress, we don't have access to a lot of the things that would help us get out of distress. It's just not made that way. So anyway, take a look on YouTube and find a video of he's probably dozens of examples of Dan Siegel out on the internet giving a demonstration and a much better explainer on the hand model of the brain. Another phrase that I love from Dan Siegel, I'm not sure if it's in Parenting from the Inside Out, but it's definitely in some of his books, which is the idea of name it to tame it. So, how I was just saying that our prefrontal cortex goes offline when we're in distress. One of the things that goes offline is our ability to name what is going on for us. So that's really scaring me, or, I'm really angry right now. We have trouble accessing it. So if, a good strategy, as you start to kind of flip your lid before it goes totally offline and we're in a full meltdown, before that, as it's starting to flip, we can say things like, I'm starting to feel angry, or I'm not sure why, but I feel kind of scared right now, or, kind of put a name to it. And if you're weak on that, I have another recommendation of a book, although I didn't bring it home, darn it, so I can't show it on the screen. But if you actually, there's an app for it. If you're weak on languaging for your feelings, if you feel like that's an area that you need to kind of improve on, or if your kiddo has trouble with giving, I'm just going to grab my phone and look up the name of this app right now. The name of the book that it comes from is called Permission to Feel. And I'm just going to look and see. Okay, the app, again, this is so knowing that name it to tame it. Naming the feeling. Naming what's going on for you tames it. It basically is putting this lid back on, or at least getting back on its way to coming back into place. It's also highly relational, so that we can reach out to somebody else with that statement of how we're feeling, and then they will be able to help us. It's when we don't know what we're feeling, it's very hard to get help. And we do want people in relationship to help us attend to that emotional dysregulation. So anyway, what I was saying is, if you don't quite have a full vocabulary of feeling, you might want this app. It's called Mood Meter, and I think it's like $2. Um, and what you do is you go into the app, and it says, like, so mine says, "Hi Deb, how are you right now? How are you feeling? How are you, Deb?" And so you answer the question by kind of getting into these categories. Well, not kind of, you are. You're getting into these little categories, and it's color coded, and I can't quite figure out how to show you that on the screen. But anyway, you choose from red, yellow, blue, or green. High energy, unpleasant; high energy, pleasant; low energy, unpleasant; low energy, pleasant. And from there, it gets into very nuanced language. So, I feel sleepy, I feel mellow, I feel relaxed, I feel secure. So if you feel like you need some work on understanding the vocabulary of feeling, I highly recommend this. Again, it comes out of all the research. Mark Brackett, I believe, is the author. I'll put that in the show notes of the book, Permission to Feel. And then the Mood Meter was adapted from that. And it's just really nice. It gives you a chance to sort of journal while you're feeling it. It gives you sometimes a prompt of how you might help yourself if you're feeling XYZ feeling, how you might, if you want to stay feeling that way. I feel happy. I would like to stay feeling happy. But let's say I'm feeling angry. It might give me some suggestions of what to do with my angry feelings. So let me make some journaling. Let me go for a walk. Let me go throw some rocks or hit a pillow or whatever might help me get out of that state if I want to change it. So it's a useful app. But all that to come back to this idea of name it to tame it. So when Dan Siegel is introducing that language, he also uses the language of the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain, that the process of languaging, putting labels to how you're feeling, brings you back up into your upstairs brain. So again, this upper part that has all of our reasoning and our problem solving and our desire to cooperate rather than to just like fight or flight, right? Which is where we get stuck when we're in our downstairs brain. So, again, kind of just talking about some resources you might find from Dan Siegel on the internet. The Permission to Feel and the Mood Meter, that's not Dan Siegel, that's Mark Brackett. But Dan Siegel has Parenting from the Inside Out, and then you could do a search on YouTube and look for phrases like the hand model of the brain, because it's a hand. It's the modeling it. It's a model that you always have with you of your brain. So you're kind of oriented this way, and you can kind of think about your brainstem, your limbic system, your amygdala, your hippocampus, all that stuff, and then the upper parts of the brain, including most notably the prefrontal cortex. Another book that I think parents would enjoy is Brainstorm. It's a book by Dan Siegel called Brainstorm. And I kid you not, the thesis that he's proving, if you ever have a chance to hear Dan Siegel explain Brainstorm, if you could go to a lecture or find it on YouTube. I went into a lecture about this book. I have the book. I've read the book. I like the book. But hearing Dan Siegel describe the book is probably one of the thrills of parenting for me, or parenting viewpoint that I've been able to use. So his argument in this presentation that I saw is basically, I'm past this stage now, thankfully. My youngest is 19. But before that, when we're entering the teenage years, so when our oldest is hitting like 12, I was terrified. All I had to go on was my own experience of teenagerhood, which, thank God I survived it. I'm not even sure how that happened. And all of the stories of everybody else about how awful the teenage years, right? They're hormone fueled and moody and up and down, and parents in fear all day, all the time about where's my kid and what are they getting into and who is influencing their life. Like, all very fearful, and also expectation of this is going to be terrible. Like, hey, enjoy parenting, but it's going to really suck when you get to those teenage years, is really the message that I had received. Okay, so you get Dan Siegel doing a presentation, and he's like, yeah, this is the message. This is what the culture tells us about our teenage years. What it's not telling us is how thrilling the teenage years are. Thrilling? Like, I could be excited about my children becoming teenagers? And the kids that I'm working with, like, I get to be thrilled and excited? Yeah, that's the argument of Dan Siegel's book, Brainstorm. What he's saying is, because we go through this process, there's a process called pruning. There's this, work on being able to regulate that brain and get this part of the brain is growing, but not fully developed. Because of this sort of unique time, his theory, his argument, and I bought the argument. I love the argument. This time frame, because of everything that's going on in the brain, it's, other than early childhood, the only other time of really active brain stuff is this teenage years, where it's like pruning. If you haven't heard about pruning, you're losing like half your brain. Like, your brain is like, this is where we're going to go, and we need to cut off everything we're not going to go. Jill Bolte Taylor, by the way, has a great talk about the process of pruning and what's happening in the teenage brain. If you ever have a chance to look that up on YouTube as well, I'll put that in the show notes, link to Jill Bolte Taylor. Let me write that down. Okay, so in Brainstorm, back to Brainstorm. So he's making this argument that because of this unique time in the brain, it's a brainstorm, right? The unique time of teenage years where the brain is going through so much change and specialization and working itself out, but also the knowledge is increasing, and the interests are becoming much more intense on the subjects that kiddos are interested in. They become much more intense. That all of our great advances, our revolutions, and our big changes happen because you have this sort of, happily, like, the impulsivity and like lack of fear, but also high interest, pushes forward important social movements. If you think about, like, the French Revolution, I think is the example that I heard in the lecture from Dan Siegel. That's all coming from this teenage vibe. So yeah, that's kind of thrilling. And then people are in their teenage years are really becoming who they are. And then you enter the stage of emerging adulthood, and that kind of gets refined, and you get to see what it looks like in reality, when they're, starting college or starting a career or starting a family, whatever they're doing in those early to mid 20s, that emerging adulthood stage. But prior to that is this sort of launching and fuel and thrilling change. So if you're looking for a different view on why we should be excited about the teenage years, so you're not just dreading it, and also there's good tools on how to deal with it and how to help them deal with their brainstorm. Like, it's hard to deal with as a parent. It's hard to deal with for the kid. Like, that's a lot going on in their brain. So the book is good for parents and also for kids, because it describes what's going on in the brain and gets you excited about the changes that are happening. Like, in the same way that we're so excited when a child learns to walk. Like, it's so exciting. Why don't we get to have the same excitement about the developmental stages of the teenage years? Like, we should be excited about that. I mean, it would be great if we weren't just dreading teenage years all the time. So anyway, if you're looking for that kind of inspiration around your parenting for upcoming teenage years, or to recover from what you just went through, if you're on the other end of that like I am, maybe it would help you make sense of what you've just been through, then you might enjoy that book. And then the other book that which I think is his first book, it's certainly the first book of his that I bought, is a book called Mindsight. And I am not totally sure on this, but I think Dan Siegel is sort of the beginning of like bringing mindful awareness into our general cultural understanding. So, right now, as we sit in 2023, as I record this video, if I say to somebody, "Oh, I wasn't very mindful today," or "I'm going to do a mindfulness meditation," or "I'm going to go for a walk and try to be mindful," or I you know, advice to a friend who's getting married: hey, make sure you're really present in the moment, at your wedding. I hope you really enjoy the experience of being there. All of that is very much a part of our cultural languaging, at least where I am here in California. It's definitely a part of the culture to kind of understand and talk about the idea of mindful and mindfulness awareness. That wasn't the case a couple of decades ago. So if you rewind maybe 20 years, that is not the case. Nobody was talking about that. So I believe it's Mindsight by Dan Siegel that brings that. At least he was a major player in bringing that into a kind of everyday awareness. And the book by which he did that is a book called Mindsight. One of my favorite parts, and probably the most well-known part of that book, is the concept of a meditation wheel. And it's a wheel, I think it's called the Wheel of Awareness, but it really gives you a tool for how to attend your mind to where you want to attend your mind, right? So putting your attention where you want your attention to be. I struggle with ADHD, so it's hard for me sometimes to put my attention where I want my attention to be. And that can improve. And in fact, we go back to the HAM model of the brain. Mindfulness helps to anchor this, help you to not flip your lid so much. So that's why we do things like a mindfulness meditation. Anyway, the Wheel of Awareness in the Mindsight book, or if you Google Wheel of Awareness or go onto YouTube and look for Dan Siegel Wheel of Awareness, you can find a time of him leading you through a Wheel of Awareness exercise, a meditation, basically. And it's got a cute story because it developed because of his coffee table was in the shape of a wheel, and that's how he got the inspiration for that idea. So that's another thing by Dan Siegel that you might enjoy. There are some other books about kids specifically and what's going on in their little brains that are by Dan Siegel. These are both by Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson. The Whole Brain Child is one of those. I'm sorry, it's probably reversed for you. And then the Yes Brain. And this book is not just about saying yes. It's just about what the concept of yes does for our brains. So, sometimes the titling of things, most parents are not of the mindset that like, oh, as long as I just say yes to my child, we're going to be fine. That's not the argument of the book. The argument of the book is we need to get our yeses in, and that makes the no's easier to accept. Actually, there's more to it than that, but you want a fair number. You want an abundance of yeses before you have to say no. And that's a theme that's carried on by another of my favorite content providers. I'm hesitating to say book because there's not a lot of books by this particular person, but there's a lot of video, and we will spend some time unpacking the great work of Dr. Karen Purvis and Dr. David Cross out of Texas Christian University. But one of the things that comes from, I believe, Dan Siegel's research and has led to some of the great work in the TBRI, which is what we'll learn about with Dr. Purvis, is the idea of yeses. Like we want a lot of yeses in before we ever have to use a no with our kiddos. And so I think that is all I have to say in my little book review of Dan Siegel. More to come.